Do you swear or affirm that, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to provide the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? Thank you very much. Welcome to the committee. You may begin your statement. You have to press it on.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Smith, and members of the committee. I am here today at your invitation to answer questions about what I know regarding the Valerie Plame episode. Back in 2005, I was prohibited from discussing it by the White House, ostensibly because of the criminal investigation underway. But I made a commitment to share with the public what I knew as soon as possible. That commitment was one of the reasons I wrote my book. Unfortunately, this matter continues to be investigated by Congress because of what the White House has chosen to conceal from the public. Despite assurances that the administration would discuss the matter once the special counsel had completed his work, the White House has sought to avoid public scrutiny and accountability. The continuing cloud of suspicion over the White House is not something I can remove because I know only one part of the story. Only those who know the underlying truth can bring this to an end. Sadly, they remain silent. The result has been an increase in suspicion and partisan warfare and a perpetuation of Washington scandal culture, one of three core factors that have poisoned the atmosphere in Washington for the past 2 decades. The central message in my book is the need to change the way Washington governs. We need to minimize the negative influence of the permanent campaign in the scandal culture and move beyond the philosophy of politics as war. No one has a better opportunity to make that happen than the President. To do so, he must first fully embrace openness and candor, and then constantly strive to build trust across the aisle and seek common ground to unite Americans from all walks of life and political persuasions. I believe President Bush could be that kind of leader for the country when I first went to work for him in Texas. He was a popular bipartisan leader who had a record of working with Democrats. Unfortunately, like many good people who come to Washington, he ended up playing the game by the existing rules rather than transforming it. The larger message of my book is bigger than any person or party. It is about restoring civility and bipartisanship and candor to our national political discourse. It is about putting our nation's interest above partisan goals. Indeed, all of us, especially those in elected office, can do more to make this happen by promoting openness and engaging in civil discourse. The permanent campaign leads to just the opposite. Substantive debates over policy give way to a contest over which side can most effectively manipulate the media narrative to its advantage. It is about power and electoral victory. Governing becomes an offshoot of campaigning rather than the other way around. Vicious attacks, distortions, political manipulation, and spin become accepted. Complex issues are reduced to black and white terms and oversimplified in the context of winners and losers and how they will affect the next election. Too often, the media unwittingly ignores the impact of government on the daily lives of Americans, focusing foremost on the Beltway game and lionizing those who play it most skillfully. There is no more recent example of this unsavory side of politics than the initial reaction from some in Washington to my book. I received plenty of criticism for daring to tell the story as I knew it. Yet few of my critics tried to refute the larger themes and perspectives in the book. Instead of engaging in a reasoned, rational, and honest discussion of the issues raised, some sought to turn it into a game of gotcha, misrepresenting what I wrote, seeking to discredit me through inaccurate personal attacks on me and my motives. The American people deserve better. Governing inevitably has an adversarial element. People and groups will always differ about the proper use of limited government resources. But should government be a process of constant campaigning to manipulate public opinion, or should it be centered as much as possible on rational debate, deliberation, and compromise? Writing this book was not easy for me to do. These are my words, my experiences, and my conclusions. I sought to take a clear-eyed look at events. To do so, I had to remove my partisan lens and step back from the White House bubble. Some of the conclusions I came to were different from those I would have embraced at the outset. My book reflects the only idea of loyalty that I believe is appropriate in a democratic government, and that is loyalty to the ideals of candor, transparency, and integrity, and indeed to the constitutional system itself. Too often in Washington, people mistakenly think that loyalty to an individual office holder should override loyalty to basic ideals. This false loyalty is not only mistaken, but can exercise a corrupt influence on government. I am here because in my heart I am a public servant who, like many Americans, wants to improve the way Washington governs and does not want to see future administrations repeat the mistakes this White House made. I do not know whether a crime was committed by any of the administration officials who revealed Valerie Plame's identity to reporters, nor do I know if there was an attempt by any person or persons to engage in a cover-up during the investigation. I do know that it was wrong to reveal her identity because it compromised the effectiveness of a covert official for political reasons. I regret that I played a role, however unintentionally, in relaying false information to the public about it. I'll do my best to answer any questions on this matter that members of the committee may wish to ask. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. One of the most disturbing revelations in your book was that White House officials, including the President and Vice President, directed you to falsely vouch for Scooter Libby not being involved in the Wilson leak. Please explain what happened and whether you think Mr. Libby was involved in that.
That happened on the Saturday after the investigation, I guess, was launched, which was on September 29th. That Saturday morning, I received a call from the White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card, and he said that the President and Vice President had spoken that morning, and they wanted me to provide the same assurances for Scooter Libby that I had for Karl Rove. I was reluctant to do it, but I headed into the White House that Saturday morning. I talked with Andy Card, and I said I would provide the same assurances for Scooter Libby, provided he gave me the same assurances that Karl Rove had. And I got on the phone with Scooter Libby and asked him point blank, were you involved in this in any way? And he assured me in unequivocal terms that he was not, meaning the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity to any reporters. And then I contacted reporters to let them know about that information, but it was Andy Card that had directed me to do that at the request of the President and Vice President.
You spoke very frequently with the President and the Vice President. Do you think either or both of them knew about the leak and had any role in causing the leak to happen, or knew that Mr. Libby was involved in the leak when they helped get you to falsely vouch for him?
I do not think the President in any way had knowledge about it based on my conversations with him back at that time when he said that Karl Rove had not been involved in it and told him something to that effect. In terms of the Vice President, I do not know. There is a lot of suspicion there. As Patrick Fitzgerald said at the trial of Scooter Libby, there is a cloud that remains over the Vice President's office, but it's because Scooter Libby put it there by lying and obstructing justice.
In the light of your testimony and your statement that you do not think Mr. Libby's criminal sentence should have been commuted, do you think that it would be any more appropriate to give Mr. Libby a full pardon?
No, Congressman, I do not. Mr. Chairman, I believe that it would signal a special treatment, the same thing that happened with the commutation. And the President has always held a certain standard for granting pardons, even going back to when he was governor and I worked for him then, and that is that the person must first repay his debt to society, and second, must express remorse for the crimes which he committed. And we have seen neither of that from Scooter Libby at this point.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Lamar Smith.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCLELLAN, your title of the book, What Happened Inside the Bush White House and Washington's Culture of Deception, implies that the President himself engaged in some amount of deception. Yet, elsewhere in the book, you say he did not engage in outright deception. Who was it that suggested the title to your book?
The title to my book, What Happened?
No, who suggested?
Or inside the White House, the
right.
Subtitle. This was something I talked about with my publisher.
And so Mr. Osnos
we came to an agreement on it, but in terms of the
since it contradicts what you
inside the Bush White House and Washington's culture of deception, that was something we all discussed.
And who is the we?
With the publisher.
That's Mr. Osnos?
Yeah, it would include Mr. Osnos.
Okay, thank you. It's been reported that you received $75,000 as an advance to your book. Is that true?
That is correct.
And you're also aware, of course, that every book that sells means more money to you as well.
I'm sorry.
You're aware that the more books you sell, the more money goes to you, I presume.
Yes, a small percentage goes to the author, usually in situations like
Is
that.
it true that Carl Weber was the project editor?
Yes, he worked with me.
Okay. Were you aware before you worked with him that he had called President Bush a clearly horrible person and said, quote, he's consciously manipulative and deceitful?
No, I was not.
Okay. So in other words, someone who called the president a clearly horrible person helped you draft and edit the book. Is that right?
Actually, this is my book. I wrote this book, and he provided great help as an editor.
Yeah. Did he edit the book?
He was an editor on the book, yes.
Okay. You write that you witnessed Mr. Rove and Mr. Libby meet in Mr. Rove's office behind closed doors, and you infer that they were conspiring to mislead the grand jury looking into the Valerie Plame investigation at the time. Did you hear any portion of their conversation?
No, sir, I did not. I say that in the book.
And so it's speculation as to your part as to what they were saying.
Well, I thought full disclosure was the only way I could go. I said I was going to discuss everything I knew about the episode.
But you were still speculating as to what you thought they were saying.
Well, I said it was suspicious to me. I said in the book, I said I do not know what they discussed behind closed doors.
Okay, and they could have been talking about, who knows, Supreme Court nominations at the time or anything else.
Well, they could have been.
Okay, thank you. And is it true that Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage has admitted that he was the source of the Valerie Plame leak?
Well, to Robert Novak, but there were other reporters that information was revealed to prior to it being public. And there was a report in the Washington Post that he identified at least 6 reporters were told about her identity.
And wasn't that the first public leak?
That was the first time it was published,
right.
But it was revealed. Her identity was revealed.
That was the first time. That's correct. That's correct. That was the first time her name was published.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you over the buzzer. Okay. The first time her name was published. Yes, right. But I mean, I'd like to make the point.
Richard Armitage.
Could I finish my answer?
Armitage has admitted that he was the source. Do you agree with that, or do you question his?
He was the initial source for Robert Novak. Carl Rove was the confirming source. Carl Rove, Scooter Libby, Ari Flesher.
And that was the first time.
Can I finish my response?
And that was the first time her name.
They also revealed her identity to other reporters prior to it being published publicly.
But that was the first time her name was ever published. Was when it appeared.
Yes, as I point out in the book. That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. McClellan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. That was a call for a journal vote. The chair recognizes the.
Mr. Chairman.
What's the problem?
Well, the problem is we're the Committee of Jurisdiction on FISA. As I understand it, FISA is.
It's a journal vote.
I understand, but could you inform the committee as to what the process is going to be and whether we're going to be available?
We're going to be on the floor, and the hearing will be suspended.
Will there be an opportunity for members to be on the floor for the debate on the rule for FISA, or just for FISA debate itself?
No, no, not the rule, but the debate. You can use your own option, though. Chair recognizes the chairman of the Constitution Committee of Judiciary, gentleman from New York, Jerry Nadler.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a series of questions to try to keep the answers brief because I only have 5 minutes. Do you have any knowledge of whether prior to or after the leak of Ms. Wilson's covert identity, either the Vice President or the President declassified her covert status in order to have it leaked to reporters?
No, I do not.
And do you have any information on the role, if any, played by the Vice President in the leaking of Ms. Wilson's identity?
No, no direct knowledge on that.
And do you have any idea why Vice President Cheney may have knowingly, indirectly, or directly instructed you to publicly exonerate Mr. Libby?
No, sir, I do not. Was not a party to that conversation with the President.
Do you have any idea whether at the time he knew that Mr. Libby had in fact been involved in the leak?
I'm sorry.
Do you have any idea whether when he gave that instruction that he knew at that time that Mr. Libby had in fact been involved in the leak?
No, I do not know that.
In any event, did you come to learn that Carl Rove and Scooter Libby had lied to you and that each of them was involved in the Plame leak?
Yes, I did.
Could you comment on that briefly, how you learned that?
That was in, well, first in July of 2005 when it was about to be reported in the media. I learned that Carl Rove had revealed her identity to Matt Cooper of Time magazine, and then a short time after that it was Robert Novak, and then within the next few months it was learned that Scooter Libby had also revealed her identity to reporters.
Okay, now the President had promised the American people, had stated publicly when this first came out, that he was going to investigate internally, find out who had leaked the information, whoever had leaked would no longer be in the administration, et cetera, because this was a terrible thing. do you know what steps, if any, were taken by the White House to conduct an internal investigation into the leak?
As far as I know, the White House counsel's office worked to provide information to the Justice Department that was gathered during the process of the investigation at their request, emails and things of that nature, but I don't know of any internal...
You don't know of any internal investigation to find out for the President so that he could fire or do what
My understanding was that we weren't doing any of that.
You weren't doing any of that. Now, the President commuted Mr. Libby's sentence. Now, this would seem... Well, do you regard this as in any way in violation of the President's pledge to find out all the information he could and make it public about this?
Well, I certainly think that the President should have stuck by his word on the matter, and I certainly view the commutation as it was special treatment. It does undermine our system of justice, in my view.
But I'm not sure what you were saying in the first part. The President's commutation of Mr. Libby's sentence was somehow not standing by his word?
Well, I don't know that it was not standing by his word. I don't know if he said anything specifically about a commutation, but he did say anyone that was involved in this would know. And I said on his behalf, no one would not be in this situation any longer. So.
And do you think, would you regard the President's commutation as, do you think it fair to infer from your knowledge that the President's commutation of Mr. Libby's, of the conviction or whatever it was, that his commutation was part of an effort to, in fact, assure that all the facts would not become public, part of a cover-up, in fact?
I do not know that. I do not make that claim, and I do not have the information to know whether or not that was the thinking. I'd already left the White House by the time he commuted Scooter Libby, but there were a lot of suspicions that are raised because of that action.
Okay. Now, switching subjects, in your book, oh, and before I go to this last question, let me, on behalf of some members of the committee, apologize to you for the aspersions as to your motives instead of asking you questions about the truth or evidence of what you wrote that we heard a few minutes ago. Such character assassination is no business in this committee. In your book, Mr. McCLELLAN, you state that the Iraq War was sold to the American people with a sophisticated political propaganda campaign that included overstating intelligence in Iraq, manipulating sources of public opinion, and downplaying the major reason for going to war. As the President's former deputy and chief press secretary, this is a very serious charge. Could you explain why you think that this was a political propaganda campaign as opposed to simply informing the American public as to what was going on?
Well, it was a marketing campaign or a propaganda campaign, however you want to refer to it. What I talk about in the book is that we took this permanent campaign mentality that is used on other issues like Social Security or education reform and used it to take the nation to war and sold the nation on the premise that Iraq was a grave and gathering danger. We now know that it was not, that the case was overstated, it was overpackaged in the way that the intelligence was used. That was something...
And by overpackaging the way the intelligence was used, do you mean that they were declassifying only those portions of intelligence that seemed to indicate the threat and not those portions of the intelligence that downplayed the threat or said we're not sure of this information?
I think it's public record that they were ignoring caveats and ignoring contradictory intelligence. The implication and innuendo that was used to talk about the connection to al-Qaeda, for instance, is one example. The Senate Intelligence Committee for the first time just released a report about how the intelligence was used.
And therefore misrepresenting the facts and misleading Congress and the American people? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think it was more to make the strongest possible case, and in doing so, they ignored caveats, they ignored contradictory,
and mislead and misrepresent.
And
therefore,
it had that effect. I do not think it was necessarily deliberate on the part of a group. Whether individuals were doing things intentionally or deliberately, I do not know. But I don't think there was a group sitting around trying to conspire to say, let's mislead the American people. Instead, it was, how do we make the strongest possible case? But when you're going to war, it is particularly troubling when you use that kind of mentality and you don't speak about the truths of the situation as best you know them, including the contradictory intelligence, including the caveats and qualifications, and including the consequences, the risk, and the cost of going into war, and we did not do that.
Thank you very much.
Recognizes the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, a senior member of the committee, Howard Coble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McClellan, let me follow up on the war issue a minute. I voted to dispatch troops to Iraq believing that Saddam Hussein was an international terrorist, which I still believe. I furthermore believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or they had the capability of developing same, which I still believe. I believe that a post-entry strategy had been formulated. I'm not sure I believe that now. Was there a post-entry strategy put together?
Post what strategy, sir?
Post-entry strategy. After we go in and take him out, Was there any sort of plan whereby A, B, C was to be followed?
Well, I think that the public record shows that there were a lot of problems with the post-invasion planning and preparation. That was not something I was directly involved in. Certainly from a communication standpoint I was, but not from the planning standpoint.
Well, that has plagued me from day one. Right. I'm still uneasy about that. But now let's shift gears to Scooter Libby. And I know we're on a short time frame here, Mr. Chairman. Your book, Mr. McClellan, includes many recollections from your experiences working in the White House during this time. I had some problems as to whether or not Scooter Libby should have been prosecuted. I still have some doubts about that. But what was your reaction, Mr. McClellan, when you learned that former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage revealed the identity of Mrs. Valerie Plame Wilson? And do you think that more should have been done to hold Mr. Armitage accountable?
Well, I can't speak directly to whether or not he should have been held accountable. I don't know the facts of why he revealed her name other than what has been reported during the trial and during the investigation publicly and what he has stated publicly since that time. Obviously, I think that all of the information should have been put out as quickly and as soon as possible about exactly what occurred and when it occurred, and maybe we wouldn't have ended up where we did. But I think that the problem here is that this White House promised or assured the American people that at some point when this was behind us, they would talk publicly about it, and they have refused to. And that's why I think more than any other reason we are here today, and this suspicion still remains.
But as to the post-entry strategy, you really don't have your hands around that.
Well, yeah, I can't speak specifically to all the planning there because that was done without me being in those discussions.
That's just plagued me, and I've said so publicly. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McClellan. Mr. McClellan, in response to a question from the chairman, you were asked about the situation where Scooter Libby, Mr. Card called you to ask you to try to get Scooter Libby also exonerated. Do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Libby himself was involved in that effort to get himself exonerated?
Yes, I do. We spoke earlier that week. I believe it was the Wednesday of that week when I told Scooter Libby that I was not going to go down a list of White House aides and start trying to exonerate them now that the investigation was officially underway. And he expressed his appreciation that I let him know that. But I think that as his name continued to surface, he certainly was behind that effort to make sure that I exonerated him. And I later saw public documents with his handwriting putting down some talking points that I should use. Now, I never saw those talking points myself until they came out in the press.
Now, you mentioned several people that were leaking Valerie Plame's name all over town. Do you have reason to believe this was a coordinated effort?
Well, I don't know for sure. There's certainly at least three White House aides that revealed her identity to reporters. But I don't know personally whether it was a concerted effort. I was Deputy Press Secretary at the time, and so I was not involved in any of that effort, if there was.
Now, it seemed to me that in response, whether or not individuals might have been involved with the leaking of the name, the administration seemed to leave a clear impression that Valerie Plame was fair game in the debate over Mr. Wilson's information. And it seemed to leave the impression that anyone who, in effect, told the truth, thereby criticizing the administration effort to get us into war, might reasonably expect problems, including having the lives of their family members put in jeopardy. Was that an intentional impression?
Well, I certainly think that for at least some people that she became just another talking point in this effort to discredit her husband, Joe Wilson. Whether or not I could characterize it before that, I would hesitate to characterize it more than that.
Well, she was a covert CIA agent, was she not?
Yes, that's right.
And revealing her identity could reasonably be expected to jeopardize her life. Is that not true?
It is a serious matter, and as I said in my opening statement, it was wrong. Whether or not it was criminal, it was certainly wrong because of her covert national security status.
And did it not leave the impression with people that family members' lives may be in jeopardy if you tell the truth about this, what's going on?
You mean people that were involved in revealing her identity?
Right.
I can't speak for them, but they should have been more careful about it, that's for sure.
Another piece of information that was involved in the run-up of the war was what the war would cost. I serve on the Budget Committee in addition to the Judiciary Committee. I was serving on the Budget Committee at the time, and we were told to ignore the cost of the war because it would be so negligible as not worthy of Budget Committee consideration. Are you aware of that testimony?
I don't know if I'm familiar with that specific testimony, but I'm certainly aware that we left the impression that it would be less costly and for a shorter duration than what has happened.
The present estimates of the total cost of the war are now $3 trillion. What information did the administration have that could have led us to believe, if we had gotten truthful information, that the cost of the war would be significant?
Well, certainly I recount in the book a conversation that Larry Lindsey had, making some projections in September of 2006, or 2002, I believe, informing a reporter that he thought it might cost somewhere between 100 and 200 billion, which at the time everybody seemed to think was high, and now we realize that even that estimate was considerably low.
And what happened to him and his estimates?
Well, he left the administration a few months later.
Was he fired?
He resigned, but my understanding that he was asked to leave as well.
So we find that his estimate was truthful, honest, candid, and turns out to be even optimistic that it could only cost $100 to $150 billion. And he was fired for telling the truth.
That's correct. It's not something that we wanted to discuss at the White House.
Now, we had a similar situation with a Medicare estimate. The prescriptive drug benefit cost, administration officials knew that the number we were working with was not the correct number, that the number was actually higher. Is that right?
I guess there was a different estimate between Congressional Budget Office and the Medicare actuaries, if I remember correctly.
And what
my brother might be better to testify for that.
What happened to the administration official that had that accurate information, and was he threatened if he revealed it before?
I understand that, yes, the administrator at the time, I understand from public records, that something along those lines did happen, if I remember correctly.
Now, is this a pattern that people who tell the truth get sanctioned?
Well, as I say in the book, I think that we have not embraced a high level of openness. This is a very secretive White House that tends to be pretty compartmentalized and very disciplined in terms of what message or talking points they put out there, and there's some things that they would prefer not to be talked about, and I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, I was wondering what you were getting at. I mean,
yeah.
you're at,
well, yes, both of us, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McClellan, is there a clarification that you'd like to make about a discussion we had earlier?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There was a comment made earlier, and I would like to clarify the record. There's a quote attributed to one of my editors, Carl Weber, describing the President as a clearly horrible person. Actually, that was a comment that was made by his daughter, and his daughter's name is on that post that is on the family blog site. Irregardless, the views and conclusions in the book are mine, and they were not affected by any editor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now turn to Mr. Rick Keller, who is the gentleman from Florida who serves on the Administrative Commercial Law Subcommittee. He also serves on the Intellectual Property Committee, and in addition, he serves on the Antitrust Task Force Committee. The gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, Mr. McClellan.
Thank you.
Mr. McClellan, all of us in public life have probably, myself included, said some things that in retrospect we wish we would worded it a little differently or used a different adjective or phrase. Is there anything in your book that if you had it to do all over again, any phrase or adjective that you might write differently?
No, I think the book clearly reflects my views and my conclusions, and I stand by them.
Thank you. Some of the adjectives, or what some people consider to be some loaded words that you used in your book, were that the Bush administration shaded the truth, used innuendo, and engaged in a propaganda campaign. You stand by those words?
I do.
Did President Bush ever ask you personally to shade the truth, use innuendo, or engage in a propaganda campaign?
Not in those words.
Did the President ever knowingly mislead you or withhold information from you?
Well, I think that one episode I recount in the book is when I learned that the President had secretly authorized the Vice President to get out some information of the National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq to reporters and do it anonymously. We had decried the selective leaking of classified information for years, the President and myself as a spokesman, and so that was certainly something that caught me by surprise and was a very disillusioning moment for me, to say the least.
Mr. McClellan, I'm referring to page 269 of your book, and you said, quote, "I never felt the President himself had knowingly misled me or withheld relevant information from me." Do you wish to change that phrase from page?
No, I don't wish to change that phrase.
So you said in the book you don't think he misled you knowingly, and just now you said you think there is an occasion where he did mislead you knowingly?
No, I'm not saying that he was trying to do it consciously or deliberately, but it had that same effect in terms of the National Intelligence Estimate. So I think there is a distinction there to be drawn.
Right. And I want to talk about your personal knowledge as opposed to your opinion with respect to this question. Did you ever witness any meeting or see any document or overhear any conversation when the President asked someone else to lie, shade the truth, use innuendo, or engage in propaganda?
It had the effect by the way we went about selling the war to the American people, as I outline in the book in some detail.
And I understand your opinions, and I think you're entitled to your opinions, and I'm not going to hit you on having opinions. I'm not going to hit you on making money off those opinions, but do you have any personal knowledge of hearing the President ask someone else to lie or shade the truth?
No, it's the whole idea of the permanent campaign mentality, and when you're trying to make the strongest case, and it's what you leave out, that it has that same effect, and that's the point I make in the book.
Okay.
Whether or not it's deliberate or conscious, it still is very troubling, particularly when you're talking about making the case for war.
Now, your purpose in writing the book, as you testified today, is to promote civility and bipartisanship and to end the scandal culture and the poisonous political attacks, correct?
Absolutely.
You write in the book about a very personal issue of the President allegedly using an illegal drug over 30 years ago, and you overhearing his private conversation with a supporter about that. What about that topic that you decided to include in your book do you think promotes civility and bipartisanship?
It's not the issue that you bring up. It's what the President, how he approached that issue, and I think it's something that a number of politicians probably do when he said that I can't recall. And my concern about that was that it later transferred over into issues of policy. That particular issue, it didn't bother me whether or not he had used cocaine previously or not. That wasn't the issue 30, 40 years ago. The issue was how he approached it and how that transferred over into other issues. And I think it tells something about his character that was important to the book.
Something about his character because he allegedly had used drugs over 30 years ago, so that says something about his character?
No, that's not the point I make in that in describing that in the book. The point I make is that he couldn't recall it, or at least he said he couldn't recall it. And I thought, how can that be? And then there were other times when I later learned that he used that same response for other issues.
Well, since that's such a key character issue, do you recall if you've ever used illegal drugs?
Yes, and I haven't.
Okay. Would you agree with...
I write about it in the book in that same section. I talk about my own experiences.
Right. Would you agree with me that nothing about that little private story of you overhearing serves to end the scandal culture or poisonous political attack culture?
Well, actually, I do. I think it's a very important lesson to look at why politicians sometimes take that approach, this defense that do not recall, when it's essentially an evasion. And the President, I think we all remember very well when he was asked about the National Intelligence Estimate on Iran, and he had been talking about how Iran was continuing to pursue nuclear weapons, and he had had a National Intelligence Estimate even during that time telling him that they had suspended their nuclear weapons program, but he said he couldn't recall in a briefing. I think that's something it's important for people to understand why a politician might take that kind of position.
I'm just saying that for some people think that you're a truth teller and a whistleblower, and you're trying to bring back civility and bipartisanship, and others characterize you differently with different motives. And I'm just saying, if you assume the best, that you really are here to promote civility and bipartisanship and do away with scandalous information, why include such a sensational fact that even you yourself is probably something you yourself have said is probably something that should be off limits?
Well, I would disagree. I mean, I think that, well, and that's why you talk about it, is that you, in part, but my purpose of this book is about changing the way Washington governs for the better. And to do that, you have to restore candor and honesty. And the President was not approaching this in a very direct and honest way. And that's why I use that example in the book.
But you didn't use that in your original book proposal that you wrote in December of '06. You didn't mention anything about this alleged drug use,
Actually,
did you?
I didn't mention it specific, but I think I mentioned that period about the 2000 campaign and going back and looking at some of those issues. It was a big issue there in the campaign,
right.
One of many issues. And I think it was relevant to talking about the President's leadership style and his character.
And some would say that you included that sensational information about the alleged drug use and his denial not to promote bipartisanship and civility, but rather to promote book sales. Would you disagree with that characterization?
I think if you read it, it's a very thoughtful look at this issue. It's not looking at whether or not the truth behind that. It's looking at a broader character issue.
Okay. Has your initial book proposal from December of '06 been reflective of the book that you ultimately wrote, or is it fair to say, as R.A. Fleischer did, that you have essentially changed over the course of the past year, and that your version of events have changed?
Well, it's fair to say that the initial book proposal included one of the key themes that I developed in my book, which was how did this popular bipartisan governor of Texas become one of the most controversial and polarizing figures or presidents in modern history. And I said that was one of the issues I wanted to look at and answer the question why. Now, yes, I started with some preconceived notions and wanted to put responsibility a lot of different places. But as I went through the book and reflected and researched things, I came to the conclusions that I did. It was a constant search for the truth as I was going through this book. I put a lot of thought into it. This book was not something that was easy to write. The words did not come easily to me, but it is what I believe happened, and it is my views and my conclusions and my perspective on things.
And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, so just indulge me. Let me leave this one final question, and I just want to be fair to you, Mr. McClellan, get your side out. That's why I'm asking you these questions. I know you have a concern about the President engaged in a permanent campaign, and I think you've made similar concerns about the Clinton White House as well, and that you'd hoped it would be different. And I can understand your cynicism from time to time, but isn't it also true that this is the same president who worked very closely with Democrats on No Child Left Behind, and to the chagrin of some conservative Republicans, he worked side by side with Ted Kennedy to allow legal immigrants to have a path to citizenship?
I write about those early days in the book. I actually talk about some of that, but you can't separate some of the other more consequential decisions that made that overshadowed some of those positive aspects.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. McClellan. And Mr. Chairman, my time's expired.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Robert Wexler of Florida, who serves the Judiciary Committee on the Intellectual Property Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McClellan, for appearing before this committee today. Your book raises many questions about an administration that is incapable of telling the truth and, in your words, avoids accountability. I want to focus on how and why Scooter Libby came to reveal the identity of covert CIA agent Valerie Plame Wilson. From everything we know about this administration, it is inconceivable that Mr. Libby would have acted alone. It is essential we learn who ordered or gave permission to Mr. Libby to expose the identity of this covert agent. The President and Vice President have denied ordering this illegal leak, but logic and the chain of command dictates that it must have been one of them. Mr. McClellan, in your book, you state that you cannot believe President Bush authorized the leak of Valerie Plame Wilson's status as a covert agent. It is unimaginable to you that the President, one of only two people with the authority to give Libby the go-ahead to make this leak, actually did it. So who does that leave us? The Vice President. You do not defend Mr. Cheney in your book. In fact, the lack of faith you express in the Vice President in your book is striking. Why?
Well, he is someone that keeps things pretty close to the vest, to say the least. I do not know what his thinking is or what his involvement was in this whole episode. I think that Patrick Fitzgerald stated it well when he talked about the cloud that was remaining over the Vice President's office because of Scooter Libby's actions that led to his conviction on 4 counts, I guess. But there's a lot of suspicion there because there are questions that have never been answered, despite the fact that we said at some point we would address these issues.
So this suspicion leads you to believe that Vice President Cheney could have authorized Mr. Libby's leak?
I can't rule it out, and I think that Scooter Libby, in his some testimony that was released, talked about it's possible that he could have first learned about her from, or that the Vice President could have even asked him to get that information out.
Well, thank you for your candor, Mr. McClellan, and your suspicion or the doubts that you raise fit in very nicely to what it is we do know. We do know Mr. Cheney has been deeply involved in the efforts to cover up the leak and exonerate Mr. Libby. We know Mr. Cheney called you to have you unknowingly lie to the American people about Libby's involvement. We know that the Vice President wrote a note where he starts to write and then crosses out the fact that the President himself asked Libby to stick his neck into a meat grinder to protect the administration. It's clear to me that Mr. Cheney's the only one left, the only likely suspect to have ordered the leak. If Mr. Cheney really thought Libby was innocent, then his note would have likely said something like, "We need to protect this man who's done nothing wrong." But that's not what Mr. Cheney's note said. The Vice President's own hand betrays him and Libby and implicates the President of the United States. These facts in your testimony, Mr. McClellan, are more than enough, in my view, to open up impeachment hearings. Furthermore, the President's use of the pardon power to deflect an investigation into his own wrongdoing by granting a commutation to the man who may have lied for him would constitute an abuse and crime of the highest order. And we must determine on this committee conclusively whether or not this happened. Thank you, Mr. McClellan, for exposing some of the lies that were propagated by this White House. But unfortunately, as you have said, I believe as well, others in this White House have been blocking access to the truth. It's time we sweep away the bogus claims of executive privilege and get Karl Rove, Andy Card, and others before this Judiciary Committee. We have the power of inherent contempt, and if need be, we should use it. Mr. McClellan, what you have provided today for the American people is enormously important. You are the first high official in this administration to come before this Congress and offer us a glimpse into the truth. I commend you for being here today.
Thank you, Congressman. I do believe it's important for the American people to have the truth.
Thank you. I now turn to the gentleman from Virginia, former chairman of the Agriculture Committee, but for many years a member of Judiciary Committee that served on the Intellectual Property Subcommittee and the Immigration Subcommittee. You're recognized at this time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McClellan, welcome. I'd like you to talk about the nature of the termination of your employment at the White House. Were you fired?
I actually describe it in detail in the book. Josh Bolton had decided to make a change in the White House press secretary position. I was also ready to leave at the time.
And you were upset about this, though, were you not?
I'm not the kind of person that gets angry or upset, really. I think most people that know me know that. I was certainly someone that was disillusioned at that moment anyway, as I talk about in the book, so I was looking to leave at some point in that time frame anyway.
You say in the book on page 299, my emotional response was strong and immediate. I thought to myself, he's ready to throw me to the wolves. I thought how long I had worked for the president and about how loyal I had been to him. I know that in your book, you immediately follow this passage with the recognition that you understood why they felt they needed to take the press secretary position in a new direction. But those are pretty strong feelings you had.
I think they're natural initial reactions, but as I say in the book, I went on to describe that I understood where he's coming from.
Let me ask you about that. Were you happy in your job before this conversation?
No, I was disillusioned at that moment. As I say, I just learned about a week or two before that about the President's national intelligence estimate being secretly declassified by the President himself.
Well, today, over 2 years after that conversation, are you still angry with Josh Bolten?
No, not at all.
Okay. You then moved on to prepare to write this book, and the Associated Press has quoted Steve Ross, who's the publisher of the Collins division of HarperCollins, as saying, books by spokespeople rarely contain anything newsworthy and have generally not proven particularly compelling to consumers, and that your proposal was, quote, shopped around, but like others who publish in the category, we didn't even take a meeting based upon past history. Now we move forward to your current publisher.
I believe I met with some part of HarperCollins, actually.
Let me then move forward to the folks who did actually decide to publish, and I'd like to read you some more quotes from your publishers. Mr. Osnos has stated of you, quote, a lot of people were skeptical about how far Scott would go in shaping his criticism. He's delivered in every respect. Were you asked to be aggressive with your criticism in the book by anyone that caused this to be published by this publishing entity and turned down by others prior to your...
No, actually there were at least 3 proposals, I believe, on the book, and no, I was not. In fact, I told each of the publishers I met with that I was going to be candid, that I was going to search for the truth, and I think Peter Osnos understood that was where I was coming from, and he appreciated that. He actually called some people, some reporters that he knew, to find out if I said something like that, could I take him at his word? And those reporters told him, yes, you can take him at his word. He is a straight shooter.
Now, where else have you appeared to discuss your book?
Oh, I've been on a book tour. I've been doing a number of interviews.
Can you give me a rough estimate of the number of TV shows that you've appeared on?
No, I think that it's probably all out there in the public realm, but there have been a number of national shows.
Dozens?
I'm sorry?
Dozens?
I don't know. I don't know if it's dozens, but it's certainly a lot.
Did this particular publisher offer you the most money?
Out of the ones that were the book proposals? I'd have to go back and look. I think there was one that was within the same range, and then the other one was a little bit less.
But basically the most. And
at $75,000, we've already said that.
In your testimony here today and on some of those other shows that you've appeared on, and in your response to Mr. Keller, that the shape of this book evolved over the original prospectus that you prepared and submitted to some publishers. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I say that in the book. Some of the conclusions that I came to were different from what I would have embraced at the beginning, because it was a constant search to try to understand the truth by taking off my partisan lens, stepping back from the White House, and then trying to give something to the American people, or the readers, what they could learn from my experiences and what we can take away from it. I think that's an important thing to give back.
Well, I have to say that I don't believe that there's any enlightening information to be gained from your testimony here today, because as many people who know you have pointed out, many of the statements that you have made in your book directly contradict statements that you made during your tenure in the White House, and have even questioned how this book was put together, because it sounds so drastically different from the Scott McClellan they knew. I know Ari Fleischer, for one, has made that statement. This puts in doubt, I think, the credibility of everything recounted in...
Well, no one's challenging Ari Fleischer. No one else is challenging the themes or perspectives in the book. They're trying to attack me personally, as I say at the beginning. And I stand by everything in this book. I was a spokesman for the president, not for myself. This book reflects my personal views and my own views, some of which I had to be able to step back and reflect on those experiences to understand exactly where things were going.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I just might add one thing. whatever your motivations were for writing this book, I can't help but think that either the allegations you make were serious enough that you should have raised these concerns while you were at the White House, or have they been hyped to sell them?
Oh, I'd say which specific allegations?
Well, there are many allegations in this book about things that could have been raised at the White House. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
The chair is pleased now to recognize the chairwoman of the Commercial and Administrative Law Committee, the gentlelady from California, Linda Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McClellan, according to press accounts, the plan to fire all 93 U.S. attorneys originated with Karl Rove, and it was seen as a way to get political cover for firing the small number of U.S. attorneys the White House actually wanted to get rid of. Many have speculated that Mr. Rove's goal in proposing the U.S. attorney firings was to pressure and intimidate U.S. Attorney and Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald. When Mr. Rove made the suggestion to fire the U.S. attorneys, he had already been before the grand jury several times in the Scooter Libby case. To your knowledge, is that account correct?
I did not have, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Sure. That when Mr. Rove made the suggestion to fire the U.S. attorneys, he had already been before the grand jury several times in the Scooter Libby matter.
I don't know the exact time, and I did not have direct involvement in terms of those personnel matters regarding the U.S. attorneys. It was not something that boiled up while I was press secretary. It happened after I'd already left.
So are you aware of any conversations involving Karl Rove or anyone else at the White House during the leak investigation in which Mr. Rove or anyone else at the White House discussed having Mr. Fitzgerald removed as U.S. Attorney or Special Counsel?
No, I'm not familiar with those conversations.
So to the best of your knowledge, those matters were not discussed during the leak investigation?
I just don't know. It's not something I was involved in.
Okay. In 2003, President Bush said that anyone who leaked classified information in the Plame case would be dismissed. And in June 2004, when President Bush was asked whether he stood by his promise to fire whoever was found to have leaked Valerie Plame's name, Mr. Bush reiterated his promise and said yes. However, in July 2005, President Bush said, if someone committed a crime, they will no longer work in my administration. Do you know what prompted President Bush to raise the bar in July of 2005?
Well, it was revelations regarding Karl Rove's involvement in revealing her identity to Matt Cooper, as well as being a confirming source for Robert Novak as well. And I think that's why the president changed the threshold there.
Who do you think in the administration should have been fired if Bush had adhered to his initial promise?
Well, if he had adhered to his word, then Karl Rove would have no longer been in the administration. I think he should have stood by his word.
Okay. Do you believe that Mr. Libby was involved in getting you to vouch for him in the press?
Yes, I do.
Can you please explain why?
Well, as I recount in the book as well, I talk about the conversation I had with Scooter Libby midweek, where I told him that I wasn't going to go down a list of White House names now that a formal investigation had been launched and we were aware of it. He expressed his appreciation but didn't say much else. And then it was that Saturday, just a few days later, when Andy Card contacted me saying that Vice President and President had talked and wanted me to basically exonerate Scooter Libby, give the same assurances I had for him that I did for Karl Rove. And so I'm sure that Scooter Libby was involved in talking with the Vice President about that. It also later became revealed in public documents that he had written out some talking points for me to use to that effect prior to that. Now, I never saw those talking points till it came out in the media.
Okay. Last topic of inquiry for me. You write in the book, the campaign to sell the war didn't begin in earnest until the fall of 2002, but as I would later come to learn, President Bush had decided to confront the Iraqi regime several months earlier. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz all saw September 11th as an opportunity to go after Saddam Hussein, take out his regime, eliminate a threat, make the Middle East more secure, and Bush agreed. When exactly did President Bush decide that the U.S. would wage a preemptive war in Iraq?
Well, he's someone that tends to govern from the gut or instinctive decisions, and he confirmed to Bob Woodward that he had asked Secretary Rumsfeld to update the war plans for Iraq in late November. He had conversations with with General Tommy Franks in December about Iraq. And so it was in that November, December, January period when he had essentially set the course that either we're going to go in with military action or Saddam Hussein will have to come clean. There was no flexibility in that approach. So he'd essentially set the policy in place at that period in time. The President is someone I know very well, and he tends to make the policy decision and then expect everybody to work on implementing that decision. And the marketing of the campaign was part of that effort.
And why do you believe that President Bush was fixated specifically on invading Iraq?
Well, I think his driving motivation, and this is something I would come to learn more when I became press secretary, that the driving motivation was this idealistic and ambitious vision that he could transform the Middle East by coercively going into Iraq, and that Iraq would be the linchpin for transforming the rest of the Middle East into a democratic region.
Great. Thank you. I have no further questions. I yield back the balance of my time.
Darrell Issa of California serves with great distinction on 3 committees of the House, of the Judiciary Committee, plus the Intelligence Committee, but the Constitution Subcommittee, the Antitrust Task Force, and the Intellectual Property Subcommittee. And we recognize the gentleman from California at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to live up to that introduction. It will be difficult. Mr. McClellan, I'm not going to be easy on you. I'm not going to be hard on you. I wasn't pleased to see this book, and let me go through why. Oh, by the way, it's good read. My reason for not being pleased may become more evident, though. You said you reflected for a period of time before you were able to properly write the book. I might propose that that reflection period was a period of time in which, had you reacted sooner, I think even you would admit that you could have affected the outcome of this administration. Had you, let's say, published this book a year earlier, you would have had some effect on an administration before its waning hours. Would that be fair to say?
I'm not sure that you're talking about changing their policies?
Well, let's just say that if you don't say anything about what you now have said in this book, you're not going to have an effect on the administration. The fact that you're now saying it is what troubled me. Had you reflected until November 5th of this year and then had the book come out, would you have had essentially a great effect on an administration on the eve of one or the other coming into office without affecting the actual election in process? And I don't know if you've given much thought to the fact that your book, quite frankly, is a political book launched in the most political time, disparaging a past administration, but in a sense that makes the war a focus, and many of the comments here today really focused on the war.
And I don't want to repeat the same mistakes that we've made when you talk about war. The other aspect of this is that this larger message, as I said, is bigger than any person or party, and it's about improving governance in Washington. And that's why it's very important to today's national political conversation more than anything else. But I wasn't finished with the book in November 2006 or 2007. This was a process. I began writing it in earnest probably in July of 2007, and it took until mid-April really to finish it. I had to push a couple of deadlines back because I wanted to make sure that the book reflected my views and that it was right, and that's why I pushed the deadline back a couple of times. I was still working through some of these issues myself.
Well, I have to agree that it takes a while to write a book, but did you consider writing any articles that would have essentially, very often, the George Wills of the world will write a series of articles that in fact are preludes to books, but they do in fact allow him to affect policy and decisions and public debate in a more real time. Did you consider doing that?
Well, I think this is affecting policy debate in a positive way.
No, but I mean, a year and a half ago, before writing a book of this length, did you consider writing 400 words?
From my perspective, people needed the full context of how I looked at these events, and that's why I talk about my upbringing and being raised in a political family, my belief in speaking up, what I was taught as a young kid.
Now, I guess I'll go on to another one because, I mean, this is not out here in a timely fashion, through no fault of yours, but it's not a timely fashion to affect this administration. So we're clearly affecting one of two.
Well, I disagree. It could affect this administration with regard to Iran.
In this case, my statement will stand. Okay. This is not going to affect this administration in the waning days. Both its friends and its foes alike, I think, believe that. And by the way, I agree with you that Iraq is not going to be the linchpin of democracy in the Middle East. And that, in fact, anyone who believed that because they were naive about what it was going to take to move that area of the world toward government that serves its people better. I've spent a lot of time in that area. I respect that the President's tried to learn about it. So I don't disagree with some of your premises in this book. Let me move on, though. The next administration is going to put a spokesperson in the White House to stand in that newly remodeled room that I understand used to be a swimming pool or something in the basement. Right. And some have said it should be made that again. What guidance would you give to the next spokesperson? For example, should they not do on camera? Should they, in fact, not be part of the spin in that sense, but rather report only in a prepared statement, the official statement of the White House, rather than taking questions and giving assurances as you did? Because in your book, I think you laid out pretty fairly, you gave assurances based on assurances. This committee could potentially have the jurisdiction to create a situation in which the next press spokesperson would, if they took those assurances, be called before this committee, and if they swore that, we could refer it for criminal prosecution, that the person who gave that official statement that was then relayed committed a crime. That isn't currently the case. If Karl Rove were to give you an assurance, or some other person, and that assurance turned out to be untrue, that doesn't create an action the Attorney General by definition go after just because you said it based on their assurance. Do you believe we should change the law so that when you speak on behalf of the President or you speak on behalf of somebody else who has given you assurances, that if false assurance constitutes a crime that would be punishable by the Justice Department?
Not something I've considered or thought about.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but hopefully you've considered it or begun considering whether or not a spokesperson on behalf of somebody, if they are relying on assurances, as this book seems to say, either should A, not be taken seriously since the assurances don't mean anything, or B, those assurances should constitute something that we codify in law. I thank you for your presence here today. I thank you for a good book, even if I disagree about the release of time, and I thank the Chairman for his kind introduction.
Thank you for your observations. The gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, is, first of all, a senior member of the committee serving on 4 committees: intellectual property, immigration, crime, and antitrust, and additionally chairs the subcommittee of border security in the Homeland Security Committee, and we recognize her now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McClellan, let me indicate to you that I am very proud of you as an American, and I imagine that there are many Americans who are likewise proud of you today. It fits right into the constitutional scheme of 3 branches of government and the responsibility that we have for oversight and the responsibility that we have for integrity as it relates to the American people. Not only am I proud of you as an American, but I'm certainly proud of you as a fellow Texan. I want to give sort of a rapid-fire series of questions, and I know that in some instances in your capacity in the Public Affairs Communications Office, rightly so, you would not be in meetings. But obviously in discussions with the Chief of Staff and staff meetings, you could get the flavor of the tone of the White House. So first, my question is, have you been paid to come to this hearing?
No, I've not.
I saw you stand and take an oath of office, or an oath rather, and do you take that oath seriously?
Very seriously.
And are you committed to telling us the truth?
Absolutely.
And do you distinguish, and do you think we should distinguish, payments made for a book from your willingness to come forward here today, take an oath, and commit to the American people that you're telling the truth?
Sure.
With that premise, I will ask you these questions.
I would hope that it would encourage others to do the same from this White House, but unfortunately I don't think that will happen.
Well, I think certainly it will add to the oversight responsibilities that are taken seriously by this committee and I think the American people. Do you believe that the President, in instances of sincerity or belief, misrepresented to the American people? Made statements that were misrepresenting facts to the American people?
In terms of the build-up to the Iraq War?
Build-up to the Iraq War. I'm going to get into a series of other incidents that you might have had in your book.
As I say, it was less than candid and less than honest by the way we went about marking that war to the American people. That's the way I would describe it.
Would you describe it as telling an untruth?
It was not completely truthful. That's the way I would describe it.
And do you believe, having sat in this room on occasion dealing with the questions of impeachment, do you believe that hearings that would discuss, hearings that would be in the context of impeachment proceedings would be warranted on the basis of untruth, or that you're not a lawyer?
Right.
But do you believe that issues could be raised?
Congresswoman, I do not support impeachment based on what I know.
Do you believe that, however, that there were instances of the untruth being spoken by the President?
I think I talk about the permanent campaign culture and how that got transferred into the war-making process, and so the American people didn't get the real truth of the situation as best we knew it. And they should have had that. They should have had all the facts before them, and they didn't. Instead, they had a partial case that was being made, or a case that was being made that only included part of the information that this administration knew.
And you've just made your comments as a personal citizen relating to your thoughts on any kind of constitutional proceeding.
Yes.
It's your personal assessment.
Yes.
Let me ask you about the efforts with Ambassador Joseph Wilson. Any lingering understanding of that? Prior to the leak of Valerie Plame Wilson's covert CIA status in July 2003, did you participate in any discussion with White House officials or other government agencies about Joseph Wilson and charges he had made behind the scenes about the misuse of Niger intelligence?
I was not directly involved in any of that. Certainly there were talking points that would have been passed around the administration, but I was not involved in the overall strategy, if that's what you're getting at, in terms of trying to discredit him.
But what did you represent to the public based upon discussions that might have had?
Well, in that initial period, I was still Deputy Press Secretary. I became Press Secretary right after, or during all that period when it was happening, the 16 words controversy over the State of the Union, and literally July 15th was my first day, and I think it was the week before that when it was really bubbling up.
So what was your sense, however, being on the inside of what they were trying to do to Joseph Wilson? Well, was he treated fairly by the actions of the White House, in as much as he was an official of government, he was a standing ambassador? It would not be thought that he would misrepresent what he had found.
I think it was wrong to start with an anonymous effort to discredit him, which I talk about in the book, which is now public knowledge. And I think it was wrong to go about it that way instead of addressing these issues openly and directly.
And do you believe that the issue with Mr. Libby, in his involvement with the issue of leaking, was an intentional action inside the White House?
I do not know for sure. I can't, as I said, I've spoken to the President. I don't think he in any way was involved in that, to the best of my knowledge. In terms of whether or not it was an intentional effort by himself, Scooter Libby, or other persons, I do not know for sure, but there's a lot of suspicion that has been left.
But you believe that the leak did generate out of the White House? Well, individuals involved in the White House?
At least 3 White House officials that revealed Valerie Plame's identity to reporters before it was publicly known.
And certainly any impeachment proceedings not only point to the actual actor that would be impeached, in this instance a president, but it will also draw the opportunity to engage, investigate all of the occurrences that might be attributable to either the misuse or the abuse of government. I know you're not a lawyer, but you understand that all of this would be laid out. Do you think the American people need to have an airing or a clearing of some of the elements that you have spoken about in your book?
I think it's always better that they have the facts and that they have the truth, and then that way we wouldn't be in this position in the first place. We wouldn't be continuing to investigate this matter, asking questions. The suspicion wouldn't be there. The partisan squabbling that goes on both sides because of issues like this would be diminished. I think it's a bad strategy to keep information from the public when they have the right to know it.
My last point, the weapons of mass destruction was a key element.
The gentlelady's time has almost expired.
Mr. Chairman, you are kind for your indulgence. I'll end on this. The weapons of mass destruction became the singular cry for the American people to be frightened into conceding to the necessity of a war against Iraq. How much goings on, how much interaction from your book, from your exposure, went on to characterize the dastardly condition that we're in because the weapons of mass destruction were about to destroy America? How much misrepresentation was engaged in that?
To characterize, I'm sorry,
the weapons of mass destruction as a dastardly potential act coming.
There was a massive marketing effort to make WMD, as well as the connections to Al Qaeda, a central part of that effort to sell war to the American people and package it as a grave and gathering danger, when the reality is that it was not as urgent or serious or as grave as it was portrayed.
So untruths prevail there.
Well, certainly less than truthful. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Dan Lundgren, a former statewide enforcement officer for California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCLELLAN, could you just succinctly say what your purpose is being here?
I was invited by the chairman, received a letter from him to talk about the Valerie Plame episode.
You were not subpoenaed, correct?
That's correct.
So what is your purpose in voluntarily coming here?
Well, I think to shed light on this whole episode.
You're not coming here as part of an impeachment proceeding, are you?
No.
Because I have listened to my colleagues now, I think, refer to impeachment 4 different times, and yet we've been told by the leadership on the Democratic side that impeachment's off the table. So my question, I guess, maybe rhetorically, is whether what we're doing here is Kucinich light. We're not there to bring up an impeachment resolution, but we're here asking you questions and then trying to extrapolate from what you say statements that then members can infer lead to impeachment of the president or others. But I just want to make sure you're not here for that purpose, correct?
I am not here for that purpose. I don't think we would be here for this purpose if this White House had been more open.
Well, no, but I mean, my question is, you didn't come here believing that someone ought to be impeached, did you?
No, I do not. As I said, I do not support that.
And I was not here in 2002 when the authorization for the United States Armed Forces, the use of United States Armed Forces against Iraq, but I just went in to get a copy of it, and it goes on for 3.5 pages for the basis for the resolution, one of which was weapons of mass destruction. Did the administration, to your knowledge, support this resolution in its entirety?
I believe so.
Was the administration talking at that time about the other grounds for going against Saddam Hussein as well?
There were other grounds that were talked about, but the chief rationale was the WMD connection and terrorism.
I understand that, but well, I guess I was going to ask you if you have an opinion as to whether Congress ever wastes time or wastes money or wastes space, but that sort of answers itself. We've got 2.5 pages talking about whereas clauses going back to the violation of the sovereignty of Kuwait by Iraq, Iraq entering into a United Nations sponsored ceasefire agreement, the United States intelligence agencies, and despite the efforts of United States intelligence agencies, international weapons inspectors, etc., Iraq was not cooperating. Iraq was in direct and flagrant violation of the ceasefire, attempted to thwart the efforts of weapons inspectors to identify and destroy Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. 1998 law passed by the Congress concluding Iraq's continuing weapons of mass destruction programs threatening the United States. In other words, the administration supported all of those points. Is that correct?
But it wasn't just those points that were emphasized. The larger point that was emphasized was, as the chief rationale, was the WMD and connections potentially to Al-Qaeda.
So administration spokespeople, when they were presented with these others, rejected them or said that they supported the overall?
No, it was where the point, I'm saying it was where the emphasis was in selling this to the American people that made it a grave and gathering danger, was and an urgent danger that needed to be addressed now, was how it was packaged together and what the emphasis was.
And you have repeatedly
and I think
used...
the Senate Intelligence Committee also reflected that in their recent report.
Hindsight's pretty good, isn't it?
Well, there's certainly things that I didn't have access to the intelligence at that point in time.
Neither did I.
I trusted the administration, I trusted the president, and part of that trust, I think, was misplaced.
And I, not being in Congress at the time, not only put some trust in the administration, but I was looking at the judgments made by both Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, and I went through repeated judgments, at least as reflected in their comments, by leading Democrats on the Senate side, who were, at least as they said at the time, reflecting on their review of the intelligence that was then available, and they were saying the same thing that the President was saying. But let me ask you this about, you have used the word propaganda a few times. On the American Heritage Dictionary definition of propaganda, it says the systematic propagation of a doctrine or cause or of information reflecting the views and interests of those advocating such a doctrine or cause. I guess that's what you were talking about, right? I mean, you were part of the machinery that was presenting a cause, and you were trying to make the best case at the time to the best of your knowledge and ability.
But when you're going, that was best of my knowledge of what?
Best of your knowledge and ability at the time.
I'm sorry, I missed the
knowledge and ability.
Oh, ability.
At the time.
Yeah, yes, I was part of that effort to some extent. Now, I was a deputy press secretary at the time, so I wasn't integrally involved in that effort during that period.
And I'm trying to, I've gone through your book in some detail, and would it be fair to say that much of it is your reflections and your opinions based on what you were exposed to at the time you worked at the White House?
It's certainly my perspectives based on the way the White House operates, knowing the President, as well as being involved in these efforts, too.
And some of it was opinion, correct? I mean, when you give us an idea of what you thought people were doing when you were not in the room listening to what they were saying, you were forming an opinion based on your knowledge, but not the knowledge of the precise facts.
Well, based on my knowledge of working closely with the President, based on my knowledge, there are a number of meetings I was involved in. There are some, this White House tends to be compartmentalized, so sometimes decisions were made in a small group of 2 or 3 people.
So you can understand how some of us might have some differences of opinion with your opinion.
Well, I was on the inside. I was intimately knowledgeable of what was going on.
I know, but I read through your book, and you called Jimmy Carter a centrist. You called Ronald Reagan a centrist. Now, I dealt with both of them, and I would describe them in many different ways, but I would describe neither one as a centrist.
That in many ways that they govern toward the center is what I was talking about during that part of the book.
Well, as centrists. The only point I'm making is a lot of what's in your book.
I think I said moderate or conservative in their views.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think that we ought to proceed on something like impeachment on opinion, would you?
Well, I've already stated my view on impeachment, yeah.
You're not here for that purpose?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Steve Cohen, Memphis, Tennessee, member of the Administrative Law Subcommittee, the Constitutional Law Subcommittee, and the Antitrust Task Force.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McClellan, you said that President Bush came to Washington, you believe, with great potential, having worked with Democrats as he did in Austin as governor and in the beginning. What events or what people do you think led him astray from the potential that he had to be a knighter? and not a divider?
Well, I think part of this was he came into this and was going to make an effort to an extent, but that he saw this as the way the Washington game is played and decided to play it just like it is played by many other people instead of trying to transform it like he pledged to do when he was running for president. I think part of that was based on his experience of seeing what happened to his father in his time in office.
So you think he had the potential to come in based on the experience he had in Texas, where he worked with the lieutenant governor and all the
right, and the speaker
there, and the system changed him, what was in Washington. Is that right?
I think that's part of it, yes.
And the vice president was put on the team because he had knowledge of the system and experience in Washington. Is that not correct?
His foreign policy experience and, yes, experience in other ways.
Do you believe that Vice President Cheney was most responsible from deterring President Bush from being the great president and uniter that you think he could have been?
Well, I think the president has to bear responsibility for his presidency veering off track like it did more than anyone else, but there are certainly some influences on him that I think were negative influences in that regard, and I would include the vice president in that.
Who was the greater influence, the vice president or Karl Rove?
I don't know that I could make a specific judgment on that, but both of them had enormous influence in terms of the direction of this White House and the way this White House operated. Of course, with the vice president, it was more on certain foreign policy elements and economic policy issues, and with Karl Rove, it was the massive political operation that exists in this White House, that existed in other White Houses as well, but when you transfer that over into the war-making process, it becomes a problem.
Did you ever hear of any decisions or people that used BlackBerries that were RNC BlackBerries or RNC emails for political purposes so as to not place those on?
Well, I certainly knew people used that had RNC emails. I didn't have an RNC email account myself, but I certainly knew that people used them. I believe that I probably would have sent emails to both of Karl Rove's accounts, his White House account and probably that account as well, just to make sure it got to him.
Are you aware of any particular policy that said to use those to avoid the government oversight?
Not directly, no direct knowledge.
How about indirectly?
No, I wouldn't say indirectly either.
Have you heard, you say you heard talk about Iraq and the buildup for war there. Did you ever hear any talk about Iran and a buildup for war with Iran in the White House?
Well, there's certainly a focus on Iran, and I sat in world leader meetings with the president where he would discuss Iran. It was a high foreign policy priority for him and remains a high foreign policy priority as well. And I think the views of people within the administration are pretty well known in terms of what we ought to be doing to confront Iran.
The president didn't attend and hasn't attended funerals of soldiers who were killed in the war. Were you privy to any of the discussions of why it was determined that he would not attend those funerals as previous presidents generally
including
did?
Discussions from him personally that he didn't want to view it as picking or choosing one funeral over another. I did attend often with him when he would visit families of the fallen and wounded soldiers as well. Those were certainly very moving moments, and I saw the president's care and concern for those troops and for those families as well.
Previous presidents attended funerals, did they not?
I believe so, yes.
They didn't worry about choosing one over another. They tried to make as many as possible. So there was a decision to make none because you couldn't make them all. Is that correct?
Well, I think part of it was, where do you draw the line? And if you do one, then you can't do the other. You're not doing the others. Does that show disrespect to others? But the president, as I said, often visits with the troops, the wounded, and visits with the families as well. And that's the way he decided to approach it.
Do you remember when he gave up golf?
No, I don't. I saw his comments about that, but I don't remember any discussion personally about this is a time to give up golf.
Yeah. During the campaign of 2004, were you familiar with any discussion about swift boating, Senator Kerry?
No, I was not involved in that, but that was more of a campaign side of things, if anything, and I wanted to have been involved in that.
Did you ever overhear any conversations about firing U.S. attorneys at all?
That was something that boiled up after I was there, so it was never something that was high on my plate in terms of press issues I was dealing with, so it's not something I ever focused on.
Several people edited your book. It's been elicited that different people edited it. What did they edit out of the book that we should know about?
I don't think there's anything that would be of interest to this committee that was, if you say edited out of the book. I think I've given a pretty clear view of the big picture things in this book, that was what I was trying to focus on, is how did this administration go so badly off course, and what can we learn from it?
You said in an interview by Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! That you mentioned the number of civilian casualties in Iraq as one of several issues you should have spoken up on while you were at the White House. one of several you should have spoken up on. What were the other issues you should have spoken up on?
Well, I mean, in retrospect, there are a number of times I think I should have spoken up more, but as I say in the book, too, in this administration, once the policy is decided, the President expects everyone to march in lockstep to that policy and not question it. You can question how it's being implemented, but once that decision's made, you're not encouraged to speak up about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McClellan.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Tom Feeney of Florida, who's a member of the Administrative Law Subcommittee and the Intellectual Property Committee as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congressman King, who ceded his time so I can make an early flight and see my son play some Little League tonight, maybe, if it's not raining in Orlando. You know, Mr. McClellan, regardless of the motives or who edited your book, there's some things that are fairly well-known facts. You, at length, you know, cite speeches and other news reports, and then there is a lot of inference and speculation and, in some cases, some innuendo based on people you know or people you assume to be true, what may have been happening in meetings that you were not in or not. And I appreciate that, but in terms of speculation and opinion, do you have a brief opinion, given your position as Secretary, regardless of the merit of your book or why you did it? Do you think in the future, at a time of war or when there's sensitive intelligence being discussed, that when a press secretary goes out, shortly after he leaves a White House, that this book is likely to set the precedent for press secretaries or deputy press secretaries to have more or less access to what is actually behind the decision-making system in the White House?
It depends on what lessons future presidents take away from this book or future administrations. If they take the right lessons, that person is going to have even more access.
Well, for example, as the Allies were deciding whether D-Day would occur in Normandy or the southern shores of Europe, should the press secretary have had access to those meetings and been available to the press, the worldwide press, to explain what the thinking and the rationale for the effort was?
No, I don't think a press secretary should ever be talking about potential war movements that are not yet publicly known.
Well, but you've speculated a lot about the motives of people, and including the president, but especially with respect to the reason for war, including the why Rumsfeld would want to go to war, why Cheney would want to go to war, why Wolfowitz would want to go to war. By the way, there's nothing new. Wolfowitz had said, you know, as you write in your book, to Vanity Fair, that one of the primary reasons that they were going to go to war and tell people was because of weapons of mass destruction. Hindsight is 20/20. You know, we all know what we know now, which we may have known at the time had Saddam Hussein complied with some more than 12 resolutions by the United Nations Security Council asking him to let the world know whether he did or did not. Why would every nation in the UN Security Council demand to know the status of a weapons of mass destruction program if we all knew or should have known that didn't exist? That's sort of a rhetorical question, but let me ask you this question, because you do a lot of speculation. Secretary Rumsfeld has a lot of experience in administrations, at defense, same thing with Vice President Cheney. They also know that history has a lot more perfect vision than contemporary rationales for war. Can you speculate on the motives of two men that have served in numerous administrations and know that they will be judged by history, why they would deliberately go out and lie about a primary justification for war, knowing full well that every history book would prove that their motivation for war was a big lie? I just can't fathom why people that experienced and that sophisticated about the way administrations are subsequently judged would deliberately tell a lie knowing that they would be outed. I can't find a motivation.
Well, actually, I think in the book I say that I don't believe it was a deliberate attempt. It was a cultural problem that exists in this city where spin and manipulation become part of the accepted culture. And then when you transfer that over from domestic policy issues to war-making decisions, the American people aren't getting the full truth, and they need to have the full truth so that they understand exactly what we're getting into.
Well, let me just respond. If Saddam Hussein had complied with what the world demanded of him, they would have had access to the truth about weapons of mass destruction. Finally, I want to, did the President know or have any knowledge about either Mr. Libby or Mr. Rover, anyone else disclosing Plame's identity to reporters?
I do not believe so, based on my conversations with the President.
Well, in fact, you say you're confident, you're convinced.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I think that's important. I understand, look, you know, that in the heat of battle and a run-up to a war, there's a lot of emotions and there's a lot of lack of knowledge. I remember after 9/11, Air Force One didn't know what direction to take off in.
Right.
And it's the job of an administration to try to tell America what they need to know, but the notion that we're going to share everything that we know with our enemies, I find very disturbing.
I don't make that suggestion.
Well, anyway, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Bill Delahunt of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On the Administrative Law Committee, on the foreign, he chairs a subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he is on the Immigration and Crime subcommittees of Judiciary.
Weapons of mass destruction.
When did he say this? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
And
Page 2. Yeah.
I don't think in any way that Mr. McClellan is suggesting that we share information with the enemy. I think it's important, however, that we share information with the American people. Let me applaud you for this book. I think you've made an excellent contribution to public discourse. I think there is much for all of us to learn, not just simply the next administration, but Congress on both sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan issue.
Right.
What struck me the most in reading portions of your book was your statement that the Bush administration lacked real accountability in large part because Bush himself did not embrace openness or sunshine in government. I concur with that. This committee and my own committee have had constant problems dealing with this administration. Currently, there is a very significant international agreement that's being discussed between Iraq and the United States that has significant implications for the American people and for the region. And despite their own rules in the Department of State, the so-called Circular 175 proceedings, there has been zero, well, maybe 1 on a scale of 100, consultation with Congress. It was embarrassing to meet with the foreign minister of Iraq, who gave us a better briefing in terms of what was under discussion than this administration. And today, in one of the local papers here, The Hill, the headline is Cheney Gets Last Laugh. Records stay secret. Veep managed to stonewall Waxman. Stonewall Cheney. You know, it can be funny, it can be humorous, but these decisions are absolutely too important. So I think you made a real contribution by opening up the debate as to what is the quality of public discourse among the institutions that this democracy relies on. And at its core, we have to have an informed citizenry. And I agree with you. I voted against the war, as did 133 of my colleagues, 125 of which, by the way, are Democrats. There was a majority of Democrats that voted against the war simply because of information in the public domain. There were heroes, like a Greg Thielman. Nobody here would know who he is. But I had him to my office. He's from the Department of State. He said, I've read everything, Congressman Delahunt. There is no nuclear weapons program. There just simply isn't. It was a hard sell, and a tragic one at that. But I think we have to look forward. I'll tell you what I found really disturbing, and I'd be interested in your comments, was the secret declassification that no one else knew about except President Bush and Vice President Cheney. You didn't know about it. None of us knew about it. Is this how we operate a democracy?
All right, it's one of the problems with this White House, how compartmentalized it is. That's a prime example of how problematic it is, too. The Chief of Staff didn't know. The National Security Advisor didn't know. The Director of Central Intelligence didn't know. We were going through a formal declassification process shortly after that, unaware that it had
This is not a democracy.
Well,
where you classify and then declassify and reclassify and keep everything secret. This is not openness in government, and I applaud you for this book.
Thank you.
And it was earlier stated that your book, others have been saying this, you have plenty of company. I can remember reading the memoir of Paul O'Neill, The Price of Loyalty. He was stunned because at the first National Security Council, he was in the room, he was the principal, and the discussion about Iraq and the instruction by the President to Rumsfeld and the then Joint Chief Shelton to prepare military operations. That was 10 days after the inauguration of the President, prior to 9/11. There was a proclivity, and we heard weapons of mass destruction and Mohammed Atta, and the dog wagging the tail about his overarching vision for the Middle East, and we all share that vision, but how do you impose it?
Right.
Is my time up, Mr. Chairman?
Well, there's a red light on the desk.
Okay. Well, can I have just another? Can I have another 10 seconds?
Of course.
I would. I chair, as the chairman indicated, the oversight subcommittee on foreign affairs, and I would like to have you and Paul O'Neill come before that committee after the election, so there won't be any impugning of anyone's integrity, and give us a view of the process, or lack thereof, because that was Paul O'Neill's problem as well as yours. There was no process. It was all gut and intuition, and now we've got ourselves in a mess. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Steve King of Iowa is the ranking member on immigration and a valuable member of the Constitution Committee as well.
I thank the gentleman, Chairman, and I'd like to start out by agreeing with the gentleman from Massachusetts. He said this is not a democracy. I couldn't agree more, and I pray it never will be, that it remains a constitutional republic where we actually have a chance to move this society forward with a representative form of government. Mr. McClellan, there were impeachment hearings in this very room back in 1998, and although I wasn't a member of this committee, I spent some days here witnessing that. I remember around that period of time, Charlton Heston made a statement, and his statement was to President Clinton, and he said, "Mr. President, when you say something that's wrong and you don't know that it's wrong, that's called a mistake. But if you say something that's wrong and you know that it's wrong, that's a lie." He drew the distinction. And I think it's important for us to look at this, and you've made reference to the 15 words in the President's State of the Union address, and I believe you're referring to his January 28, 2003 address, which I happen to have the copy I had in my hand when he gave that address, and I'll read these words to you, and I think these are the ones you referred to. The President speaking in that State of the Union address, quote, "The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa," close quote. That's the reference, I believe.
Right.
Do you believe that that was a mistake or a lie when the President said it?
Well, I actually talk about it in the book at length, and I think the President thought it was credible to be saying that at the time, that it had some substantiation. I don't know what every individual knew about that or was passing along. I think some questions remain there.
Let me submit that I don't believe it was either a mistake or a lie. I believe that the language in here sustains itself as the accurate and factual truth even today. We did learn from the British.
Well, but our CIA disagrees with that at this point.
I have in my hand a CIA report. This is a debriefing report from Ambassador Joseph Wilson within 2 hours of the time that he arrived back home after his 2 weeks in Niger. He's been before this committee. I didn't have this report in my hand on that day. I wish I had. It's dated, though, the debriefing date, 8 March 2002. Are you familiar with this report?
I'm not. I may have seen it before. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, just for your edification, for that of the committee, let me just read from this report, debriefing on the return. And I'm going to submit that this report directly contradicts Joseph C. Wilson, 180 degrees, where he testified in his report to the CIA. He references former Prime Minister Ibrahim Mayaki. He says, however, Mayaki did relate that in June of 1999, a Nigerian-Algerian businessman approached him and insisted that Mayaki meet with an Iraqi delegation to discuss expanding commercial relations, and that's in quotes, between Niger and Iraq. Although the meeting took place, Mayaki let the matter drop due to the United Nations sanctions against Iraq and the fact that Mayaki opposed doing business with Iraq. Mayaki, the former prime minister, said that he interpreted the phrase expanding commercial relations to mean that Iraq wanted to discuss uranium yellow keg sales. Mayaki said he understood the rogue states would like to exploit Niger's resources, specifically uranium, but he believed the Nigerian government's regard for the United States as a close ally would prevent sales to these states from taking place despite Niger's economic woes. Now, this is verbatim from the CIA report that was secret and now been released, retracted, and I ask unanimous consent to introduce this into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And I recognize that it catches you a little bit unaware. I trust you have not seen this report nor the language in it.
Not recently. If I've seen, I don't know if I've seen it before. I'd have to look at it. But certainly in October of 7th, 2002, for the speech the President gave in Cincinnati, the CIA director had said, take this information out that relates to Niger. Steve Hadley recounted that in conversations I was participating in at the White House later when the 16 words became, well,
Mr. McClellan, watch the clock, and I'm sorry, but as recognizing there was a backpedaling on the part of the White House, I'm going to submit that the State of the Union address remains factual today. They did learn from the British. Whether it turned out to be upheld in later statements or not, they did learn from the British. This statement of Joseph C. Wilson's contradicts his 4 years of calling President Bush a liar. And I would submit also that, let me pose this question. If you had to choose, if your life depended upon it, and you had to choose between putting your trust in Ambassador Joseph Wilson's veracity or that of the President of the United States, where would you put your life?
I don't know that I'd jump into that hypothetical kind of question.
Okay, and I'm going to take that as an answer to that question. I'll pose another one then. And what is your advice to your successor secretaries, White House press secretaries, as to how they should handle themselves and how a president might want to handle them? There's two parts to this question. What would you say to the succeeding secretaries on whether, at what point they should step up and tell the world in the middle of their job, perhaps, and how will the president handle this from this point? Does he have to then put the next press secretary into a cubicle and slide press releases to him under the door for fear that he'll be coming, either write a book or come before the Judiciary Committee and divulge information that I believe was at least from a national security, not national security, but from the integrity standpoint? Could you not have taken some of this to the grave with you and done this country a favor?
I think that by speaking up about these issues, that the country can learn much from what went wrong and what we can learn from that. And that's why I wrote this book, because I want to see things change here.
That may well be true, and it'd be a different lesson I take from you and Mr. McClellan. Thank you for your testimony, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Hank Johnson is a lawyer magistrate from Atlanta, Georgia, serving on the Administrative Law Subcommittee, the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, and the Crime Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McClellan, I appreciate your attendance today. During the course of President Bush's administration, there were 5,626 petitions for commutation, which were received and processed by the Office of Pardon Attorney, which is a part of the Justice Department. And of those, prior to Mr. Libby's commutation, President Bush had granted just 3 petitions for commutation. And so in other words, he actually denied 4,108 of those petitions, and the other ones were closed without presidential action, presumably by the Office of Pardon Attorney. And this reluctance to grant mercy on these commutation petitions is consistent with with President Bush's conduct with respect to death penalty cases when he was governor of Georgia. Isn't that
Texas,
governor
yes.
of Texas?
Right.
Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. Yes.
He presided. He had the distinct opportunity to preside over a record number of men and women. In fact, 150 men and 2 women, a record unmatched by any governor in modern American history. He presided over 150 executions as governor of Texas and